Good morning, students. I hope all is well. Well, we are in Module 8. In Module 8, we explore a different literary expression, which is poetry. In this video, I'm going to spend sometimes with you providing some tips on how to read poetry, how to make a sense of poems. And we will also read a couple of poems. For example, Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. That is her signature poem. And Langston Hughes, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So what I want to do here, I want to give some recommendations on how to interpret poetry. Then I am going to apply those recommendations into Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and Langston Hughes, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Well, when you read a poem, it's important to pay attention to the title of the poem. For example, you should reflect on what the title of the poem means. Usually, the title of a work of literature is connected to the meaning or to the thesis statement, to the message that work of literature attempts to convey. So, what does the title mean? You should be focusing on that. For example, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, as we see here, the central, the keyword here is death, okay? Because I could not explains the speaker's action, the speaker's inability to prevent death. Okay, so there is a I in the title in relation to death. So I could not stop for death means the inevitability of death in human existence. Second, I want you to read the poem several times. Read it out loud like this. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess and they rang. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. So you see here, you want to read the poem out loud. Pay attention to the way those words in the poem produce music, produce sound, and pay attention to punctuation. Punctuations are important in poetry. Sometimes they designate a pause, a long break, excuse me, and sometimes you have to pay, you really have to pay attention to accented syllable and unaccented syllable. Sometimes you have to raise your pitch to make a louder sound. So read the poem out several times. Read it carefully. Okay, do a quick read, then read it carefully. Okay, read it line by line and stanza by stanza. At this moment, I am not asking you to make any connection between the stanzas or between the lines. All I want you to do is to perform a reading. Read it out. So, after you read the poem, for example, I just read the first three stanzas of Emily Dickinson's signature poem, which was published in 1863. And now the next thing I'm going to do, I am going to try to use my own language, my own expression to write down this poem, to rework this poem in my own words. So I'm going to use my own words, my own expression to rewrite it. Okay? Now, this is very important. Now, when you write the poem in your own words, what we call paraphrasing, okay, the exercise of paraphrasing, it's going to become more meaningful to you as you are attempting to make a sense of the poem using your own language so you can understand, so you can relate that poem to another person. For example, if your 8-year-old brother or 8-year-old sister says, Johnny, what does this poem mean? Can you put those words in your own words, right? The words of the poem in your own words. You should be able to do so without any hesitation. Now, after you pay attention to the meaning of the title, you put the poem in your own words, that is, you paraphrase every line in the poem of every stanza consisting of that poem. The next thing you want to do here, you want to think about the meaning of the poem. What does the poem mean? Now you at this point in your literary activity to determine the meaning of the poem, the interpretation of the poem, right? For example, when we read the first stanza of Emily Dickinson poem, the first line begins with a reason, because I. It's very personalized. So that means I is doing the action. Then there's a transition between I to he. He kindly stopped for me. If you're looking at, if you're following with me, I'm actually on page 872 in your book. I'm sorry. I should have informed you about the page. 872. He kindly stopped for me. You see the use of the verb stop twice, okay, in the first stanza. The first usage of the verb has to do with something that occurred in the past. I could not expresses the speaker's inability to put an end to this human experience, what we call death. The second use of the verb stop, it's also in the past tense. He said, the poem reads, he kindly stopped from me. Well, because I could not do it, that expresses the powerlessness of the speaker. He kindly stopped for me connotes the power of death as a personification of a masculine figure. How do I know death is personified as a male? Because of the subject pronoun he. Kindly stop for me. Now, the adverb kindly designates a virtue. It designates death's virtue of being kind, of being nice, being gentle. So this is the first thing we learn about the person of death. He is kind. And in the next two lines and the first stanza say the carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Now, this is very important. First, it happens that the speaker is on a voyage with death. How do we know? Well, the carriage, okay, the word carriage designates a car that carries people, that transports people from one location to another, from point A to point B or to C. We know the carriage contains two individuals, death itself or himself, since he's a male, and the speaker who is I. How do we know? Well, we see ourselves, I plus he equals ourselves, us. Okay, now we're not dealing with I, the personalized I anymore, or the third person he any longer. Now we are talking about unity. Okay, I and he become one, ourselves. We're talking about the union between I and he in the poem. So they're together in the poem. So in the word the immortality, this is very important. The word mortality refers to the possibility of death, the possibility of someone's end of life, end of journey. So when we put the prefix M, I am, immortality designates something that cannot die. So now, who cannot die? This is very important in the poem. Look, I would argue it is ourselves. That means we. First is death, second is I, right? The reason I say I belongs to, I becomes immortal because I is now a companion of death. To say that I and he are immortal is to say that life beyond this life does not end. There is an afterlife. Okay, so this is the meaning of the first stanza. So we go to the next one. The next set. We have a set of questions for you, maybe 6 to 7. So when we try to determine the meaning of a poem, we need to pay attention to what the poem means. Some of the questions we need to pay attention to some questions. For example, who is the subject of the poem? Who is the subject? When we use the word subject here, we're talking about the person who happens to be the centrality of the actions of the thoughts embedded in the poem. The second question we want to ask is this: what are they talking about? What are they talking about? In other words, what's going on? What's going on in the poem? Okay? What's the underlying argument in the poem? What's taking place in the poem? Okay? What does the speaker want to convey to us as readers? So this is what we mean by what are they talking about. The third question, you can see I'm looking I'm talking to you, I'm also looking at the book because I'm looking at another poem that I want to integrate in our analysis. The third question you want to talk about is, why do you think the author wrote the poem? Literature has meaning. Words have meaning, guys. Every word has meaning in relation to other words in the poem. So this is very important. You need to find out the meaning the author seeks to convey through the words of the speaker. So far, we mentioned the word who, we're talking what about the subject, and why. Why do you think the author wrote the poem? Okay? So, when we go back to Emily Dickinson's poem, what we see here, Dickinson is alerting or signaling or indicating, demonstrating that we as human beings should be able to prepare for death in this life while we have life in this world. So this is more of an ethical decision, ethical preparation. She wants us to be concerned, not in a bad sense, right? Be concerned about the practicality, the possibility of the end of our lives. We all gonna die, regardless of our age, regardless of our gender, nationality, the language that we speak. It doesn't matter if we're pretty, if we handsome. Death will one day knock on our door. Now, the fourth question I want you to be concerned about: when is the poem happening? When is the poem happening? So we're talking about time frame. So time frame or history matters when we read a poem. Okay, history matters because history can inform us about what's going on. What was going on at that time when the poet, right, wrote the poem. Very important. So we some historical trajectories, some historical events might bring great enlightenment to us as we think about when the poem happened. Now, the next question we should pay attention to is the question of where is the poem happening. You see, literature is an event. So we're using the word happening very intentionally because we conceive literature as an event, an ongoing event. Literature never dies. As Shakespeare tells us in Sonnet 18, literature does not die. Okay, as long as you have breath to breathe and eyes to see, okay, I will sing your line to the world. Now, so where it has to do with the setting, pay attention. Sometimes poets use metaphor, simile, they use imagery to convey the setting of the poem. Setting of the poem could be, for example, could be an urban area or suburban area. It could be the countryside. It could be in the winter. It could be during the summer. So we need to pay attention to words in the poem that give the sense of happening. So the next question we need to pay attention is the poet's attitude. What is the poet's attitude here? Now, when we look at Emily's poem, we see the speaker in the poem is very calm. Okay? The attitude of a speaker refers to the mood of the speaker. For example, the speaker could be mad or expresses anger. The speaker could be in a state of relaxation, joyfulness, and so forth. Or the speaker could be in a state of moderation. The speaker here is not afraid of dying. The speaker is calm. In fact, he enjoys or she enjoys her journey with death. And the next two stanzas go like this. For only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulip. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. The cornice in the ground. Since then, these centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So, again, we encounter here, if we look at this poem, the setting here is in the cold season. Well, cold season and hot season. Okay. First, how do we know? Well, look with me. Look at line 11 and 12. The idea of gazing grain, setting sun. Setting sun designates perhaps humidity, or it could be summer, and fields of gazing grain, harvesting season, right? Harvesting season. Also, when we move to the final line, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, line 14, we also see that there's another setting here, what I call seasonal setting. It's cold. It's cold. How do we know? Well, the speaker tells us after he passes us, right, the dews drew quivering and chill. So it was cold. Okay, it was cold. The next question we want to ask is this: how does the poem shift from person to person or between times or places? Okay, for example, and let's go back to the first stanza. We see there's a shift between I and he. Okay, and the second stanza, we see a shift between we, I, my, and he. We slowly, I had, my labor, my leisure for his civility. Here, the speaker tells us when death stops, knocks at his door or her door. She had to put away everything that includes work, my labor, entertainment, hobbies, my leisure too, because death was civil. Okay, death was not brutal or toxic or aggressive. Okay, civility is another virtue here. In the first stanza, we encountered the word kindness. So he passed us designates the overpowering presence of death. Okay. We also see a shift. I mentioned a shift in seasons, the heat in the summer. Okay. And finally, to bring this to a close, looks like we're not going to have the time to explore Langston Hughes' poem, but I just wanted to give you some tips, doing an overview on how to read poetry. Now, let me say this for last. Let's talk about the devices. You see, poets use literary devices, literary elements, or what we call tools of the poet to convey a message. So you need to pay attention. You need to be able to identify different poetic devices, different literary tools that are employed in the poem and what they seek to convey. Okay, because they're all connected. All literary devices, all poetic devices are intimately connected to the poem's message. Again, pay attention to simile here. That means when you have a comparison, the use of like or as. Pay attention to the use of metaphor. Metaphor is a poetic device that is used for direct comparison. Pay attention to personification. You see the word person here. For example, in this poem, we're dealing with death. Death is personified as a human figure. Is given human qualities. Human qualities are given to non-human beings, things like death. That is a phenomenon. However, human qualities as power, civility, kindness, tranquility are given to him. Pay attention to the tone. The tone of a poem has to do with the emotion. The emotion expressed through the voice of the speaker when the speaker talks. Point of view is very important. Who's telling the poem? Is the poem written from the first person and point of view, or the third person point of view? Imagery. What are the pictures or used in the poem to convey different messages? So we're talking about the way a poet might create pictures with words. Alliteration has to do with the repetition of the same letter. And finally, you need to be able, after you've done all of this, you need to be able to identify the central theme, central idea of the poem. Every poem, I would argue 99.9% has a central idea. A poem is a narrative. A poem tells a story. You want to be able to know what the story is. Okay? If you do not know what the story is, read the poem again. Go over those questions, those tips I have given you. Finally, you want to read some work of criticism on that poem so you can understand what others have written. Okay, I hope this conversation was helpful to you. Have a great day, students.